everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking back in time, but not in the way you might be thinking.
Yeah, no time machines involved, unfortunately.
No, not yet, anyway. But we are going to be looking at ancient DNA and what it's teaching us about history.
It really is remarkable what we can learn from just tiny fragments of genetic code. They're like these little whispers from the past, giving us clues about our ancestors, their journeys, and how they lived.
Exactly. And for this deep dive, you sent me some really cool stuff to look at. We've got some excerpts from an article about Eske Willerslev, who's like a pioneer in this whole field.
Oh, yeah, Eske Willerslev. He's done some really groundbreaking work with ancient DNA.
Yeah, he's like the Indiana Jones of genetics or something. We also have a transcript from one of his lectures, which is fascinating stuff. But before we get too deep into that, maybe we should start with the basics, huh? Like, what exactly is ancient DNA, and why is it such a big deal?
Okay, so ancient DNA is basically DNA that's been extracted from ancient biological material. So think bones, teeth, hair, even fossilized feces, whatever might have some DNA left in it.
Wow, so you're telling me we can get DNA from like a 10,000-year-old piece of poop? That's wild.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. But it's not easy, that's for sure. The DNA is often really degraded, like a puzzle with most of the pieces missing. Plus, there's always the risk of contamination with modern DNA. So it took a long time for this field to really take off.
I can imagine. It sounds like a super delicate process. So how did they overcome those challenges?
Well, for a long time, scientists could only really analyze mitochondrial DNA, which is easier to recover but only gives you part of the picture. But around 2010, there was a big breakthrough. Researchers, including Willerslev, figured out how to retrieve a nearly complete ancient human genome, and they developed methods to account for that contamination problem.
So that's when things really started to get interesting.
Yeah, that's when ancient DNA went from just a curiosity to this incredibly powerful tool for understanding our past.
Okay, so now we're talking about having the complete genetic blueprint of someone who lived thousands of years ago. That's insane. What kind of things are we learning from this?
Oh, all sorts of things. For one, it's helping us to rewrite the story of human migrations. Like, take the peopling of the Americas. It was the last continent to be inhabited by humans, right? So there have always been a lot of questions about how and when they got there.
Yeah, in school they taught us about the Clovis first theory, which said that people arrived in North America around 13,000 years ago, and they walked through this corridor that opened up between the ice sheets.
Right, the ice-free corridor. That was the dominant theory for a long time. But Willerslew's research has really challenged that. He found evidence that people were living in the Americas even before that corridor opened up.
Really? So how'd they get there if the corridor wasn't open yet?
Well, one possibility is that they migrated along the Pacific coast. And Willerslew's work at the Paisley Caves in Oregon provides some really intriguing evidence for that.
Paisley Caves, what's so special about those?
Well, archaeologists found ancient human feces there, or coprolites. And these coprolites date back to at least 14,000 years ago, which is older than Clovis.
Wow, so people were already in the Americas before the supposed ice-free corridor even existed. That pretty much blows Clovis first out of the water, right?
It does, and this was just the beginning. Willerslev also made some amazing discoveries about the origins of Native Americans. For a long time, people thought they were descended solely from East Asian populations that crossed the Bering Strait.
Right, that makes sense geographically.
Yeah. But Willerslev found that there's a much more complex story there. Native Americans are most closely related to Siberians, but there's a significant genetic distance between them. And that suggests there must be other ancestral roots somewhere.
So they weren't just from East Asia.
Right. And then comes the amazing story of the Malta Boy.
The Malta Boy, what's that? Some kind of ancient legend?
Not quite. It's a 24,000-year-old skeleton that was found in Siberia. And when Willerslev sequenced his genome, he found something truly remarkable. The Malta Boy was closely related to both Europeans and Native Americans.
Wait, hold on. This Siberian boy had genetic ties to both Europe and the Americas. That's mind-blowing.
It is. And it suggests that Native Americans were actually descended from at least two distinct populations, an East Asian group and this Malta-like group.
Wow, so it's like a giant puzzle, and each ancient genome we find helps us to put another piece in place.
Exactly. And the picture keeps getting more and more fascinating.
Okay, so we've got people in the Americas earlier than we thought, and they came from a much more diverse mix of ancestors. What else did Willerslev find out about the ice-free corridor?
Well, he actually developed a really innovative way to study that. Instead of just relying on human remains, he started analyzing DNA, from ancient sediments.
Hold up, DNA from dirt. How does that even work?
It's pretty amazing. See, all organisms shed DNA into their environment. And this environmental DNA, or eDNA, can persist in places like sediment for thousands of years. So by analyzing the eDNA from different layers of sediment, you can get a snapshot of what plants and animals were living in that area at different points in time.
So it's like a genetic record of the entire environment. That's brilliant.
It is. And Willerslev used this technique to show that the ice-free corridor didn't actually become habitable until around 12,600 years ago.
Which is long after people were already living south of the ice sheets. Okay, so that pretty much settles it, right? The first Americans didn't come through the ice-free corridor.
Right. And it really highlights how ancient DNA is challenging everything we thought we knew about the past.
So Willerslev basically turned our whole understanding of early American history upside down. But he didn't stop there, did he? What about his work in Europe?
Yeah, he's made some incredible discoveries there, too. One of the most interesting stories comes from a skeleton known as Kostenki 14. It's one of the earliest modern human skeletons found in Europe, dating back something like 36,000 to 38,000 years.
Wow, that's going way back. So what did Kostenki 14 tell us about early Europeans?
Well, when they sequenced his genome, they found that he wasn't a direct ancestor of modern Europeans, but he did have many of the same genetic components.
Huh. So even tens of thousands of years ago, the building blocks of modern European genetics were already in place. It makes you wonder what their lives were like back then.
It does. And to get a better sense of that, Willerslev compared Kostenki 14's genome to another ancient skeleton called Ust-Ishim, which was found in Siberia and is even older, around 45,000 years old.
Okay, so we've got one from Europe, one from Siberia. What did that comparison reveal?
Well, it helped them to figure out roughly when Europeans and Asians diverged from a common ancestor. They estimated this split happened sometime between 45,000 and 36,000 years ago.
That's amazing. It's like these ancient genomes are giving us a glimpse into the deep branches of the human family tree.
They are. And sometimes they reveal some pretty surprising things, too. Like, for example, they found a late hunter-gatherer skeleton in Spain that had genetic resistance to animal pathogens.
Resistance to animal pathogens. But I thought that only developed after humans started domesticating animals.
That's what everyone thought. But this finding suggests that early humans might have been exposed to these pathogens much earlier than we assumed.
Maybe through hunting or scavenging.
Possibly. It really changes our understanding of the relationship between humans and microbes throughout history.
It's crazy to think that even tens of thousands of years ago, our ancestors were already engaged in this complex dance with their environment, adapting and evolving. But then everything changed with the Neolithic Revolution, right? When humans started farming.
Yeah, that was a huge turning point in human history. And one of the big debates has always been whether agriculture spread through people adopting new ideas or through the migration of people who already knew how to farm.
So did hunter-gatherers just learn to farm from their neighbors, or did farmers actually move into new areas and bring agriculture with them?
It's a great question, and ancient DNA has helped to answer it. Willeslev's team analyzed skeletons from Sweden and found a clear genetic difference between hunter-gatherers and early farmers.
And what did that tell them?
It suggested that the spread of agriculture in Europe was at least partly driven by the migration of people. Hunter-gatherer ancestry was more common in the north, while farmer ancestry dominated the south. So it seems like there was a movement of people from the south bringing farming with them.
So it wasn't just a transfer of knowledge, it was a movement of people bringing a whole new way of life.
Exactly. And that movement of people and genes continued into the Bronze Age, which was another incredibly dynamic period.
The Bronze Age, that's when we started making tools and weapons out of bronze, right?
Right. And it was also a time of major migrations and cultural exchange. To understand what was going on, Willerslev and his team sequenced over 100 ancient genomes from the Bronze Age.
100 genomes. That's a lot of data.
It is. And it revealed that the Bronze Age was a time of incredible upheaval. A group known as the Yamnaya, who came from the steppes of Eastern Europe, spread westward into Europe and eastward into Asia.
So they're like the ultimate road trippers.
Kind of. And they didn't just travel light. They brought with them their knowledge of bronze making, their mastery of wheeled vehicles, and possibly even lactose tolerance.
Wait, are you telling me our love of cheese might be thanks to these Bronze Age migrants?
It's a possibility. And in Europe, they mixed with the existing farming populations, spreading their genes and their culture. But in Asia, They seem to have replaced many of the existing populations, including a group related to that Malta we talked about earlier.
Wow, so the Yamnaya really left their mark on both Europe and Asia.
They did. And then came other migrations, like the Santashta culture, who were known for their chariots. So the Bronze Age was basically this giant mixing pot of cultures and genes, and it really set the stage for the world we know today.
It's amazing how these ancient migrations are still shaping our world today.
They are. And in the midst of all this movement and mixing, they also made a pretty shocking discovery.
What's that?
Plague.
Plague? As in the Black Death. But I thought that was centuries later.
It was. But when they analyzed those Bronze Age skeletons, Willerslev's team found evidence of Yersinia pestis, the bacteria that causes plague, in several individuals.
No way. So plague was around thousands of years earlier than we thought.
Yeah, and this early strain was different. It could only be spread through close contact. It hadn't evolved that flea-borne transmission that made the Black Death so devastating later on.
That's wild. So even in the midst of all this cultural advancement, our ancestors were still facing deadly diseases.
They were. And speaking of challenges, we can't forget about those incredible creatures that roamed the Earth during the last ice age, the megafauna.
Oh yeah, the woolly mammoths, the saber-toothed cats, the giant sloths. What happened to them all?
That's a question that has puzzled scientists for a long time. Was it human hunting that drove them to extinction? Or was it climate change? Willerslev tackled this question too, you know.
Of course he did. He seems to have investigated just about everything.
He did. And he used that same multidisciplinary approach, analyzing ancient DNA, reconstructing past climates, looking at the archaeological evidence. And what he found was that climate change was probably the main culprit.
So it wasn't us humans hunting them to extinction?
Well, maybe in some cases.
Yeah.
But Willerslev found evidence of a dramatic shift in vegetation during the warming period at the end of the last ice age. And as the plants changed, so did the food sources for these giant animals. They just couldn't adapt fast enough.
So they basically starved to death.
Essentially, yeah. It's a sad story, but it highlights the powerful forces of nature and how even these massive creatures weren't immune to the impacts of climate change.
It's a good reminder that we're not immune to those forces either. But before we move on, I have to ask about that 700,000-year-old horse genome. That just blows my mind.
It is incredible. They extracted DNA from a horse bone, preserved in permafrost in Alaska, and managed to sequence the entire genome.
So we can get DNA from something that old? That's crazy. What did they learn from that?
Well, for one thing, it helped them to solve a mystery about Przewalski's horses, which are the last surviving wild horse population.
Those are the ones from Mongolia, right?
Yep. And for a while, people weren't sure if they were truly wild or if they were descended from domesticated horses that had escaped. But the ancient horse genome showed that Przewalski's horses are actually a distinct lineage that split off from other horses hundreds of thousands of years ago.
So they really are the last wild horses.
That's amazing. And I guess it shows just how far back in time we can go with ancient DNA now.
It does. It's
Wow.
truly revolutionary. Who knows what other secrets are hidden within the DNA of ancient life?
It feels like we're just scratching the surface of what's possible.
We are, and I think that's what makes this field so exciting. There's so much left to discover. Okay, so I think we've got some time for questions from our listeners. Looks like we've got a lot of curious folks out there.
Always great to see people engaged.
Okay, this first one is a big one. Could we ever bring back extinct animals, like the woolly mammoth? You know, like a real-life Jurassic Park?
The mammoth question. It's one that comes up a lot, and it's definitely something that Willerslev has talked about too.
So is it actually possible? I mean, could we really have mammoths roaming the earth again?
Well, scientists have already sequenced the mammoth genome, so we've got the blueprint, so to speak.
Okay, that's a start.
And now they're exploring ways to use gene editing to introduce mammoth genes into the genome of Asian elephants, which are their closest living relatives.
So not quite bringing back a pure mammoth, but creating something like a hybrid.
Exactly. But it's still incredibly complex, both scientifically and ethically. Cloning is hard enough as it is, let alone cloning a genetically modified elephant-mammoth hybrid.
Yeah, I can imagine. And then there's the question of whether we should even do it. What would be the impact on the environment? Would it be ethical?
Right, there are a lot of big questions to consider.
Definitely food for thought.
Yeah.
Okay, next question. This listener is curious about the sample sizes used in these ancient DNA studies. You know, how can we draw conclusions about entire populations from just a handful of skeletons?
That's a great question, and it's one of the limitations of this field. We're always dealing with incomplete data.
So it's like trying to understand an entire civilization from just a few fragments of pottery.
Kinda, yeah. But it's getting better all the time. As we find more ancient genomes, the picture becomes clearer, and scientists are developing better statistical methods to make the most of the data we have.
So it's like piecing together a giant puzzle, and each new discovery adds another piece.
Exactly.
Okay, here's a question I've been wondering about. Is there a limit to how far back we can go with ancient DNA?
It's hard to say for sure. I mean, the oldest DNA we've sequenced so far is that 700,000-year-old horse from permafrost.
Which is mind-blowing.
Right, so I think it really depends on finding well-preserved material. Those frozen environments are ideal for preserving DNA.
Makes sense. The colder, the better, I guess.
Pretty much. And as technology improves, we might be able to extract DNA from even older remains. Who knows what we'll find?
Exciting times. Okay, this next one is about the ethics of studying ancient human remains, especially those of indigenous populations.
Yeah, that's a really important consideration. It's not just about the science, it's about respecting the ancestors and the beliefs of those communities.
So it's not just about extracting DNA and publishing papers, it's about working with those communities and being sensitive to their concerns.
Exactly. It's about obtaining informed consent and making sure that the research benefits everyone. And in some cases, it might even involve repatriating the remains after they've been studied.
So it's a balancing act between the scientific value and the cultural and spiritual significance of those remains.
It is, but it's a crucial one.
Okay, here's an interesting question about human evolution. Do you think humans are still evolving now that we have modern medicine and technology?
The old "are we still evolving" debate. It's a good one. I think the answer is yes, but maybe not in the same way as before.
So we're not going to suddenly sprout wings or anything?
Probably not.
Mm.
But our environment is still changing, and we're still adapting to it. Think about things like antibiotic resistance, for example. That's evolution in action.
Wow, you're right. Bacteria are evolving right under our noses.
They are. And humans are still evolving too, just maybe in more subtle ways. Maybe we're becoming more resistant to certain diseases or adapting to new diets or environments.
So evolution is an ongoing process. It's not just something that happened in the past.
Exactly.
This next question is about eDNA. They're wondering how you can tell what an entire ecosystem was like from just the DNA and sediment.
All right, so remember how we talked about organisms shedding DNA into their environment? That eDNA can last for a really long time, especially in places like sediment. So if you take a core sample of sediment, each layer represents a different point in time.
It's like a layer cake of history.
I like that. And you can analyze the eDNA in each layer to see what plants and animals were living there at that time.
So it's like a snapshot of the ecosystem at different points in time.
Exactly. And you can track changes over time, see how the ecosystem responded to climate change or human activity. It's really remarkable.
It is. Okay, this listener wants to know what periods of human history you find most fascinating from an evolutionary perspective.
Oh, that's a tough one. There are so many. But I think the transition to agriculture and the Bronze Age are particularly interesting.
Because that's when things really started to change for humans.
Exactly. We went from being nomadic hunter-gatherers to settled farmers. And that had a huge impact on our biology, our diet, our social structures, everything.
So it wasn't just a cultural shift, it was a biological one too.
Right. And then the Bronze Age brought even more changes.
Yeah.
New technologies, new migrations, new diseases. It was a really dynamic period, and I think it laid the foundation for the world we live in today.
So it's like we're still living with the consequences of those ancient events.
We are. And that's why understanding the past is so important. It helps us to make sense of the present and maybe even shape the future.
Now, before we wrap things up, we have one last question, and this one is definitely in the realm of science fiction. Could we use ancient DNA to bring back lost human traits?
Ooh, that's a good one. Like, could we somehow give ourselves the immune systems of our hunter-gatherer ancestors?
Or the lactose tolerance of those Bronze Age pastoralists?
Right. It's definitely an intriguing idea. I mean, theoretically, we now have the tools to do it. But it would be incredibly complex.
And not to mention, ethically questionable.
Exactly. Who gets to decide which traits are desirable? And what would be the unintended consequences? It's a slippery slope.
It is. But even if we never actually go down that road, just thinking about those possibilities is pretty mind-blowing.
It is. And I think it shows just how powerful ancient DNA is as a tool. It's not just about understanding the past. It's about exploring the potential of our own biology.
It's like ancient DNA is giving us a glimpse into the future as much as the past.
I love that way of putting it.
Well, folks, we've covered a lot of ground today. From the peopling of the Americas to the extinction of megafauna to the ethics of gene editing, ancient DNA is touching on just about every aspect of our world. And I think it's safe to say that we're only just beginning to understand its full potential.
Absolutely. This field is moving so fast, there's no telling what amazing discoveries are just around the corner.
So stay curious, keep exploring, and who knows? Maybe someday we'll be able to answer some of those big what if questions. Thanks for joining us for this incredible deep dive into the world of ancient genomics. It's like we've traveled through time without ever leaving our seats.
It really is amazing to think about, huh? All those stories hidden within those tiny fragments of DNA.
Yeah. Makes you realize how connected we are to the past. Like, all those ancient humans, they're not just names in a history book, they're our actual ancestors.
They are. We're all part of this long, unbroken chain of life that stretches back millions of years.
And it's just crazy to think that we can now access their stories through ancient DNA.
It's like having this direct line to the past. We can see where they came from, how they lived, what challenges they faced.
Speaking of challenges, it makes you wonder if we could use ancient DNA to solve modern problems, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. There's so much potential there.
Like, what if we could figure out how our ancestors adapted to different climates or fought off diseases? Could we use that knowledge to, help us deal with climate change or create new medicines?
Yeah, those are some big questions. And honestly, we're just starting to explore those possibilities, but the potential is huge.
It really is. I mean, just imagine if we could unlock the secrets of the Neanderthal immune system, or figure out how those Bronze Age pastoralists developed lactose tolerance.
Right. Yeah. Who knows what kind of amazing adaptations are hidden within ancient DNA? It's like having a genetic toolbox from the past that we can learn from.
But of course, we have to be careful, right? I mean, there are ethical considerations with all of this.
Oh, absolutely. It's not just about the science, it's about the ethics too. Like, who gets to decide which ancient traits are desirable and which ones aren't?
Yeah, it's a slippery slope for sure. We don't want to end up creating designer babies or anything like that.
Right. We have to proceed with caution and have those tough conversations about the ethical implications of this technology.
Definitely. Well, I think that about wraps things up for our deep dive into ancient genomics. It's been an incredible journey, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. From woolly mammoths to ancient plagues to the origins of Native Americans, it's just amazing what we're learning from this field.
And the discoveries just keep coming. It feels like every day there's something new to learn about our past.
It's true, and I think that's what makes it so fascinating. This field is constantly evolving, just like the DNA we're studying.
So to all our listeners out there, stay curious, keep exploring, and who knows, maybe someday you'll make the next big discovery in ancient genomics.